Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream by podcast. Today I'm joined by Chrissy Hansen, and today she joins me to discuss Dave Allen, a plagiarist who has also made terrible arguments about the Testimonium Flavianum with a extremely hypothetical reconstruction in which he hypothesizes that Josephus talked about the historical Jesus, but doesn't name him either. So how exactly does that work? In fact, how can we even know it's Jesus at all if the original text didn't even have his name in there at all? So with that being said, I'll turn it over to you, Chrissy.
Hi, everybody. Before we get started, I also just want to advertise. I got a book. Get my book. But yeah, so to get started, I want to start with that. We first have a lot of problems with Dave's work. I have known Dave for a while. In fact, his first paper that passed peer review, I helped him with some of the drafting on it. I did not realize at the time that he was essentially just plagiarizing other people's work at various places. This is especially true of when it comes to any kind of quotation or ancient sources. He cannot read Greek. He cannot read German. He cannot read, it looks like, any of the relevant languages at all. And so he relies on other people for all of this, and then rarely ever actually credits them. So he'll just quote a mass quotation, never give a citation to where it belongs. So the first thing that we're going to do actually is I want to just look at a few examples of this, because it's not only just plagiarizing a few citations and quotations from ancient sources, it's also other stuff. So I first got pinged on this because I saw that he had posted a Facebook comment and things looked really eerily similar. So if you look on the left here, this was a post he made on Facebook not very long ago. And he lists, all the different evidences for Jesus in the Pauline letters. I got to this point specifically where, on number 4, where he says that Jesus may have had a temperate personality, not boastful, proud, or seeking self-pleasure. And it struck me because I remembered writing that. So I went and I looked, and what Dave did not know is that while my old website is no longer public, because I made it using Wix, I actually still had an archive of it. And so I had an archive of all my blog posts. And on the right, you'll see this is all just cribbed exactly from my blog post. He just copy-pasted it. My guess is that he has copy-pasted a whole bunch of quotes and different elements into Word documents and then didn't attribute where they come from and then just felt free to use them whenever. So he just has all these different hodgepodges of things that don't belong to him. In this case, he stole from me. Now, this is not the only time he actually stole from me. I found other occasions on his blog where he was plagiarizing from a unpublished book draft that I have. This was something I wrote for my own personal use. It's called The Quest of the Mythical Jesus. It was never supposed to be released publicly. It was for my private use, and Dave began sharing it in Facebook groups as a draft. and spreading it everywhere. And then he started plagiarizing pieces of it in his blog. So that was interesting to find. And so I talked about this publicly on a Facebook group. And then Christopher Lawson was like, yeah, he plagiarizes my work too. And then I was told by another person, Scott Bignell, that his work's been plagiarized by Dave as well. So it's an ongoing thing. Dave is a serial plagiarist. Not only that, he also just screws up his sources. So, for example, here we have a quotation from Johannes Nussbaum. And, it has this whole, and it's this whole thing like, in De Excidio, Hierosolimiantio 212, Pseudo-historian paraphrases, etc., etc., etc. There are two things that I noticed about this. Firstly, I knew that Johannes Nussbaum only wrote in German. So I was curious, but I couldn't find the source. And the reason for that is because this is what Dave cites. He cites Johannes Nussbaum, Das Testimonium Flavianum, ein authentischer Text des Josephus in Novum Testamentum 52, published in 2010, pages 72 through 82. I investigated this, and I could not find any publication matching that description by Johannes Nussbaum, which was a big problem. Because when I did look up the title of this paper, it actually went to Ulrich Victor. So what's going on here? Well, Johannes Nussbaum did publish a piece on the Testimonium Flavianum, and not really published. He wrote an undergraduate thesis that he uploaded on academia.edu. And that is where that quote comes from. But that quote was originally in German. So I ran the original German section actually back through Google Translate, and it came out identical to what Dave had. So I also know that in his published papers, Dave Allen is using Google Translate. It's embarrassing. And then he confuses his sources because he cannot read German, and he ended up mixing up Ulrich Victor and Johannes Nussbaum together. On top of this, then we get to the plagiarism of ancient translations. For example, I'm just going to do this one. This is a presently copyrighted work written by Shlomo Pines. And this is his English translation of Michael the Syrian's version of the Testimonium Flavianum. This is a copyrighted translation. Dave Allen steals this without any citation on page 216 of his paper, A Proposal, which was published in Revista Biblica. In total, Dave plagiarized me, Scott Bignell, Christopher Lawson, and he probably plagiarized others that I have no idea about. His paper, Model Reconstruction, alone plagiarizes citations from Photius, Origen, Justin, Lucian, Josephus, Epictetus, and also a ton from the Slavonic, which is stolen from Leeming and Leeming's translation of Marcheshki, and also Tacitus. The gospel quotations he's always stealing from the NIV without attribution. So it is a clear pattern. Anytime that you come across an ancient citation of any kind and it's quoted, Dave Allen is stealing it from other people. He is taking other people's hard work and he is passing it off as his own. And he knows that this is wrong. And I know he knows it is wrong because Christopher Lawson told me personally that he messaged Dave about this and told Dave that he should stop plagiarizing people because Chris Lawson isn't going to even cite any of Dave's work because he doesn't even know what Dave's work is. Dave just steals things, passes it off as his own. It is, in every way, academic fraud. His papers should be retracted for this. In any other field, especially in like a scientific discipline, they would be retracted for plagiarism. It is inexcusable.
Yep.
because of this, I'm just going to operate from the standard that Dave's papers are academically dishonest, and that's how we're going to progress through this. How do we want to start with his absolute nonsense on the Testimonium Flavianum? Because there is so much to cover with this nonsense.
Do you know how his idea began to develop? Do we know anything about that? Or if not,
we have a little bit. So the first publication he ever did on the Testimonium Flavianum was actually in Bob Price's Vanity Press Journal, the Journal of Higher Criticism, and it was bad. It exhibits all the same plagiaristic tendencies that I have discussed before. Here he reconstructs it basically along the same lines that he does in the Journal of Greco-Roman Christianity and Judaism. And the process is basically just hodgepodging things. Dave doesn't actually have any kind of methodology at play. He just thinks he finds things that sound polemical and useful and piles them together, and he comes up with absolutely wild ideas. So one of the early things that he comes up with is that Jesus is not named in the original Testimonium Flavianum. His justification for this is two texts: the Slavonic Josephus, now better recognized as Old Church Russian, and then a text called De Excidio, which was written by a figure we call Pseudo-historian. This is a completely nonsensical argument. So he argues that these are earlier and non-Eusebian, which means that they are not reliant on Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, and he does so on very specious grounds. In the case of the De Excidio, the argument is that De Excidio omits reference to Jesus being the Christ, which it would not do if that were authentic. And then also that it includes elements from the Jewish antiquities that are not found in Eusebius, and so it's probably independent. The argument's absolutely nonsensical. It's primarily derived from Alice Wheely and James Carlton Paget. Alice Wheely's argument is self-contradictory. So one of the arguments for it being non-Eusebian is that it also quotes the John the Baptist passage, and it has the same order that is in Eusebius or in Antiquities, where Jesus comes first and then John the Baptist, and they're separate. The argument's again completely incompatible, because one of her other arguments is that it has a passage that is also in Antiquities, but not in Eusebius. Now, here's the funny thing about this passage in particular, is that it occurs after the Jesus passage and before the John the Baptist passage when it's in the original Antiquities, but in De Excidio, it occurs before either of them. So if you're trying to argue for the independence of documents based on the order that they place things in, like the narrative order, it has to always be consistent. The fact that it is inconsistent, therefore, means that Wheely's argument is nonsense. It shoots itself in the foot. So, this argument fails completely. There's also other indicators here as well that De Excidio is probably reliant on Eusebius, including that it has various elements in the narrative of John the Baptist in particular that look like they're derived directly from Eusebius, because they are not found in Antiquities. For example, in Antiquities, it just calls John a good man. In Eusebius, he is called righteous. And in Hegesippus, he's called sanctus. It looks like Hegesippus is just playing up the same terminology, which is different in Eusebius from Antiquities. You also have things like it completely messes up details on Herodias, which is only explicable given the merging of elements from the Gospels that is going on, and it's first done in Eusebius. The first time that the Gospel narratives and Josephus are merged is Eusebius, so there's a pretty good indication. There's also several other places throughout De Excidio that look like they rely on Eusebius. And then on top of that, every single time it uses Antiquities in any other place, all of them are defective. It never actually quotes Antiquities closely, and in fact, it frequently and routinely screws up what is in Antiquities, which gives us the impression it's not looking at Antiquities very closely. Thus, De Excidio cannot be independent. There's no good case for it. Josephus is even worse. Because there is no indication that Antiquities was even available to the old Russian chronographer. On top of that, there's another really big problem, which is that in both De Excidio and in the Slavonic, they both name Jesus. Like, they both do, explicitly in the text. And Dave has just completely omitted this and is hoping you don't notice.
I remember pointing that out to him. Like, I think it was like a PDF copy of the Leeming and Leeming translation in the computer, and as I just copy and pasted the Testimonium Slavonium, sent it to him, I'm like, hey, it's got Jesus' name right there. You want to explain that to me? And he's like, oh, no, it's just a comment or something, commentary. It's not really there or something. He said something like that to me. He tried to dance around it.
No, it is. And not only that, but it was also present in the original headers that were in the oldest manuscripts as well. And this is where Dave has to just try and find some way to get around this. So there are two versions of the Slavonic Antiquities, or Slavonic Jewish War, which have come down to us. There's one that is just littered with Christian interpolations, quote unquote, and elements that just clearly are not from Josephus. And then there is another version which omits a bunch of these. Not all of them, but a bunch of them. And so the argument is over whether is which one came first. Dave wants to argue that what's called the separated edition, the one that is missing all of these Christianized elements, is the earlier version. This argument is nonsense. And the reason we know it's nonsense is because we can look at the ways in which the text was altered. Very specifically, the text is only altered in places which are overtly Christian or which explicitly name Josephus as a third actor. And so we know the reason this happened because, and we know this because basically there are early manuscripts of this text, and it has the author's name as Josephus written on them. The ancient scribes that were copying this thought that Josephus was the writer of this text, that they had handed down to them a version of Josephus's Jewish War. And knowing that he was ardently Jewish, they decided to omit a whole bunch of things that looked Christian or directly contradicted the idea that Josephus was the author. For example, when the Testimonium Flavianum occurs in the Slavonic, in the older manuscripts, it introduces him by mentioning Josephus by name. That can't be if Josephus was the author. It's not. It's because it's a third-person reference. So they omitted it. They omitted a whole bunch of stuff like this to de-Christianize the text. We all also know that regardless of which one came earlier, they cannot, none of them can be independent of Eusebius. Why is this? Well, because it's almost certain that they used two different authors as sources, George Hamartolos and John Malalas. Both Hamartolos and Malalas have the Testimonium Flavianum. Hamartolos also has the John the Baptist passage, and they also have numerous other passages which the Slavonic copies. There are places like discussions of funerary rites and different things like this that are all copied from Hamartolos and Malalas throughout the Slavonic. So we know it's not independent of Eusebius. And what makes us even more certain that it's grabbing the John the Baptist and Jesus passages is when you look at, for instance, the John the Baptist passage, both Hamartolos and the Slavonic omit the mention of Macarius, the fortress. This is not absent in Antiquities, and is not absent, if I recall, in Eusebius either. I might be wrong on that, but regardless, that points to a reliance on an intermediary that used Eusebius. Very directly. They make the exact same omission. Dave's explanation is that, no, he just had a version of Antiquities that didn't mention the fortress, which is absurd because we have no manuscript evidence that that was ever the case anywhere. So yeah, and then the same problem occurs where John is actually named in the original text. It was just omitted later. We know this was the case. So Dave's argument is primarily nonsensical. There are other things, for instance, that he argues that both De Excidio and the Slavonic try to downplay Pilate's role in the execution of Jesus, which is actually completely wrong. De Excidio explicitly says that Pilate had blame for his role. It explicitly lays blame on him for Jesus's execution. And in fact, the entire episode in the Slavonic Testimonium, which is partly derived from elements of the Gospels, where Pilate receives 30 talents of silver to execute Jesus, is part of a late medieval trope. And in this is a late trope where essentially opinions, while late antique opinions on Pilate were starting to be reversed and they were becoming friendlier toward him, in the Eastern Christian Empire, the Byzantine, in the Middle Ages, opinions of Pilate actually begin reversing and becoming more negative. So you actually end up with some medieval forgeries, like a forgery of a letter from around this time, which seeks to portray Pilate in really bad terms. And one of the accusations is that Pilate was bribed to kill Jesus. This is, in fact, a medieval invention, and it precisely dates the Slavonic Testimonium to being a medieval creation. It cannot be. It cannot go back to antiquity. We can date it because of the polemic's emergence by that time. And this throws everything that Dave has under the bus with those texts. Another element is the idea that the Slavonic and the and De Excidio omit reference to Jesus being the Messiah, the Christ, is also incorrect. The Slavonic Testimonium explicitly calls him Christ Jesus in that order, in a passage that directly parallels the exact same passage found in the in our Textus Receptus of the Antiquities. So no, there's no argument to be made that it omitted mention of him being Christ or that his name was Jesus. Similarly with the Slavonic. So this basically throws everything that Dave has completely into the trash bin, because at that point he has no actual independent witness for the Testimonium Flavianum. Yeah, so at that point he has to try conjuring up other people who may have used it. And it's basically all conjecture based on like single words and bits and bobs like that. So, for example, he really wants the pronoun tis to be authentic. This pronoun is found in one manuscript of Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, where he quotes the Testimonium Flavianum, and he writes that there was a certain Jesus, like a sage of a man, a wise man. This is, and it's specifically certain. Here, certain is basically in Greek a pronoun, tis. And so what Dave originally argued in his Journal of Greco-Roman Christianity and Judaism paper was that this term was derogatory. And he lifts this argument straight from Fernando Bermejo Rubio. The argument is nonsense. Tis has no derogatory meaning whatsoever. And in fact, every single example that both Dave and Fernando Bermejo Rubio cite either work against this thesis, or you can easily show why it's not the case. So, for example, they refer to Josephus will refer to a certain magos thetis. Here, the negativity comes from the term magi, because that was an extremely negative term in most of Josephus's writing. It's not because of the pronoun. They've just completely messed up what actually has the negative connotation in this passage. So it gets worse because Christians routinely just refer to Jesus with the pronoun tis, or they'll refer to him as a certain Christ or the one Christ, using variations of that pronoun. And it goes all the way back to the book of Acts. There is no way around this. It has completely positive usages throughout Christian.
Yeah, so, kind of like, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and on top of that, it's not found in any actual manuscripts of Josephus. The only way that he justifies this being authentic is because there is a phrase in the Slavonic which translates to a certain man to describe Jesus. So he argues that it comes from the Greek, anertis. But this is incorrect, because the Greek version in Codex A, in the Ecclesiastical History, does not read anertis. It says the tis in this case comes after the name Jesus, and then is separated by sophos, honor, which means a certain Jesus, a wise man. They don't attest to the same phrase. So he claims it's multiply attested, but it's because he doesn't understand Greek and he doesn't understand the Slavonic either. He is just mixing and matching based on English translation.
It kind of reminds me of the arguments that some make that the James passage is genuine because why would any Christian put in there legomino Christo, called Christ? But in Matthew, I believe it's in chapter 1, that phrase, or a very identical phrase, is used in which Jesus is called Christ.
Yes.
Legomino Christo. So Christians do use that phrase. We know that they do. So it was not uncharacteristic of them, but they want to act like that it is uncharacteristic for some reason.
Yeah, well, and it's used throughout Christian literature as well. I am working on a paper on this subject, excuse me, and it is found in Justin Martyr uses it, Pseudo-Clement uses it, Alexander in his Inventio Crucis uses it. And then there's also very close versions. Justin actually uses it twice, both in the dialogue with Trypho and also in the first apology. Eusebius uses it in his Demonstratio Evangelica 412. He uses a very interesting phrase, which is "O Christos tou theu vic foros Viciforos legomenos," which is the Christ of God called Victor. And then Eusebius also uses it in his Generalis Elementaria Introductia, and it's then used also again in the Gospel of Matthew. It's used in the Dialogus Timothy et Aquilae, so on and so forth. Just down the line, there's no problem with this phrase. They use it positively, they use it negatively. Origen uses it positively in another case where he calls him he says he's called the Son of God, and so like it is not negative. It's in no way a negative phrase, and this was debunked back in the 1980s by Graham Twelftree. But yeah, this is basically this thing where people like Allen are trying to project negative intonations onto Greek terms in the hopes that if they are negative, we can say that a Christian wouldn't invent them. Not only is it usually fallacious because they don't know the Greek terms and they just assume they have a negative connotation incorrectly, but it's also fallacious reasoning from the start. The idea that a Christian couldn't interpolate something derogatory is absurd. Why not? We certainly know that Justin Martyr had no problem fabricating an entire fake Jewish guy named Trypho and then putting all sorts of derogatory labels on Jesus in the mouth of Trypho. This was standard practice of them to invent opponents or to invent negative language for their opponents. So why wouldn't they? Give me a good reason. We have quite clear evidence to the contrary that they did do this. It is a fallacy that presumes that all interpolators engage in their practice with an unadulterated, consistent piety. And it is an assumption that we cannot hold up. So all that thinking is fallacious down to the core and should not be taken seriously. The arguments that Dave has get worse. So, for example, one of the big problems with trying to identify whether or not a source uses the Testimonium Flavianum is that the Testimonium Flavianum is pretty small, and every single bit in it is, for basically, to put it lightly, the kind of stuff you could just get out of like a Christian creedal formula. So another source that Dave wants Josephus to have used is Tacitus. He argues that Tacitus's Annals 1544 is reliant on the Testimonium Flavianum. For those that don't know, this passage in Tacitus is the infamous passage where he talks about like Christians being killed by Nero, burned alive, etc., for the conflagration of Rome in the mid first century. And in this passage, he has a little brief aside about Jesus. And so he talks about like he briefly says that Jesus was executed by Pilate, that he's called Christ, that he has followers that thrive today. So, a number of like cursory similarities with the Testimonium Flavianum. Ken Olson pointed out in refuting Dave Allen on a blog that this looks identical, though, to the sort of stuff you could just get from like any Christian. Like, there's nothing unique about it that uniquely points to the Testimonium Flavianum specifically. So, it's a big problem, because if you can't point to any specific evidence that Tacitus used Josephus here, then we don't have a reason to assume that he did. Dave's response is that that Tacitus might have used Josephus in another work. So in Tacitus's book called The Histories, he has a whole passage on Jews and the Jewish War, and he also has like an oracle and a few other details about it. And Dave Allen and Steve Mason and a few others argue that there are enough similarities to argue that he's reliant on Josephus here. Now, there are two main problems with this. I discussed this actually in my own published paper on Tacitus, but none of the similarities are very close. For example, when discussing the number of people who are killed or who flee, they don't get the same numbers. The oracle that happens during the siege of about when the siege is about to happen, telling people to flee for the gods have left them, is different in Tacitus than it is from Josephus. It's also even more different in other texts as well, which in my opinion points to this just being like a common court tradition rather than specifically deriving from Josephus. And then on top of this, the Testimonium Flavianum has actually wild divergences from Tacitus's testimony on Jesus. They're very different in numerous places. So there doesn't seem to be actually enough similarity between any of them to say they're reliant. But let's just assume that Tacitus did use the Jewish War, where he gets like the oracle and a few other things. Let's assume Tacitus had this. This does not prove that he had antiquities. And in fact, we actually know this similarly from like Tacitus's work, that it was quite possible and in fact common for people to only have access to like a single work from an author and not know of their other literature. So for example, Tacitus's histories were widely used, but the annals fell into disrepair and was basically forgotten. Another example of this is actually with Josephus. The Jewish War was what almost everyone knew about, whereas citations to antiquities are exceedingly sparse until you reach Origen and Eusebius. Jewish War is like the dominant source. So what we can tell is that people didn't know antiquities very well. So if they didn't know antiquities, and if we cannot prove that antiquities was known to Tacitus, we cannot say that he knew antiquities just because he knew Jewish War. That's a fallacy. That is just fallacious reasoning. Dave has tried to dismiss this, saying that I'm just making an argument from silence. I am not. It is not an argument from silence. It is pointing out that that reasoning is fallacious. That they know one text does not mean they know the other text. One is not evidence of the other in and of itself. And this continues down the line. Dave does not have a single source anywhere that he can point directly goes back to Josephus's Testimonium Flavianum. There's only one other citation he can point to that could plausibly have known of a Testimonium Flavianum prior to Eusebius, which is Origen, and Origen never quotes it. And Dave's excuses for that are just excuses. He claims, for instance, that Origen says that Josephus was not a Christian, and then later he says that Jews do not connect the life of Jesus with the life of John the Baptist. Those are the only two pieces of evidence he has to indicate that Origen might know a Testimonium Flavianum. This is nonsense thinking. Because, as we know from the book of Acts, from the Pseudo-Clementines, and from other texts, there were John the Baptist followers who didn't even know Jesus existed. In the book of Acts, Paul supposedly comes across Baptist followers who had never heard of Jesus. So this is not evidence of anything, because he does not specifically say that Josephus makes this claim. He says that Jews do, in general. The claim that Josephus did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah can just be gathered from reading his text, which is overtly Jewish. He makes similar claims elsewhere. He'll just blanketly say Jews do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah in other places. And he also has this passage where he talks about a Greco-Roman philosopher named Moiragenes, who wrote a biography of Apollonius of Tyana. And he says that Moiragenes was not a Christian. Does this mean that he must have talked about Christianity in his biography of Apollonius? Not at all. It just means that Origen was able to use his eyes and read. So this is not so nothing in Origen is actually evidence that he knew the Testimonium Flavianum. In short, nothing that Dave cites, not a single thing, actually points to any of his hypotheses. And in order for his hypotheses to be right, he has to lie about what's in these sources, completely misrepresent them, and tell you that there are things that are not there which are, or to tell you that there are things which are there which are not. And then on top of it, he has to plagiarize a whole bunch of other people's work.
And speaking on that, there's somebody in the live chat that got confused and thinks that that the only thing brought up in the discussion about that was the Facebook plagiarism, but you did bring up the papers earlier. Could you briefly reiterate on him plagiarizing in journals?
Yeah. So what we find is that what we found, and you can look back in the video. I think Dave also linked my blog post going into more detail on this. But Dave plagiarizes copyrighted translations of ancient sources from other people. He messes up routinely citations to other people as well. And then there are various other occasions where he'll just crib English translations of like the Bible from the NIV, which is copyrighted as well, and without attribution. He'll take on his blog posts, not just on his Facebook posts, but on his blog posts, he was also stealing from myself. He was stealing from Christopher Lawson, and he was stealing from Scott Bignell, all without attribution. This is a pattern. And when I'm talking about my stuff, I'm specifically talking about my previous blog posts as well as a draft of a book that I wrote. I shared the draft with him, but I told him not to share it around. He shared it around against my will, and then he started copying pieces of my draft for his own work.
And in the papers, you managed to find several examples of him plagiarizing, including even taking footnotes from other people, citations from other people, without citing those citations too.
And mixing up citations between different authors. So attributing papers by Ulrich Victor to Johannes Nussbaum, because Dave cannot read German, and so on top of all of this, he can't read any of the ancient languages or any of the relevant modern languages in the field, aside from English. So you get hilarious bits like um, Google translating German in a published peer-reviewed paper. It's unacceptable. It's hilariously incompetent.
I also have a link to Chrissy's paper in the description below, and also pinned in the live chat. And I'm going to have it in the pinned comment when this live stream is over. So basically, just to summarize what you're saying about his different arguments about the testimonium, he's basically cherry picking different pieces of different testimoniums from all over the map to reconstruct a hypothetical original.
Yes, and then what he's also doing is cherry picking pieces from different critics of early Christianity, so different words and phrases, and saying, well, these could go back to an original negative testimonium, and they don't. He has no evidence that they do. So, for example, claiming that Justin Martyr's so there's a point at which Justin Martyr says that Jesus was not a sophist. And Dave claims that the sophist polemic could go back to the original Testimonium Flavianum. Except that, and he argues that the word sophist, the phrase sophist honor, was a rewrite of sophist. So instead of wise man, he was just a sophist, a liar, like a pseudo intellectual. Basically a very common insult. The problem is that the word sophist is like a stock polemic that could derive from anywhere. You cannot trace this back to an original testimonium, especially considering that there's no evidence Justin Martyr knew a single work by Josephus, as far as I'm aware. It's complete conjecture, but he does this all the time in various different places. Let me find the paper because it's really bad. Yeah, here it is. He wrote another paper in the Journal of Higher Criticism where he just goes through and he tries listing endless examples of people who supposedly used his negative testimonium. So you get like Celsus, and it all comes down to like a single word or a single phrase. And none of it's remotely compelling at all. He's just picking and choosing things to try and make his case as best as possible. And there's no evidence that anyone knew that this testimonium even existed. This is one of the biggest problems, but I want to specifically get into the one that I think kind of just shoots his entire theory in the foot, which is that his reconstruction makes absolutely no sense at all. Because there is no way on Earth that anyone could identify who this was if they were not already in the know. Like if they didn't already know exactly what Josephus meant, there's no way they could figure this out. Because this is what Dave's version of the testimonium reads as. He said, this is his version, I'm going to quote it. And there was about this time a certain man, a sophist and agitator, for he was a deceiver and an impostor, a teacher of men who worship him with pleasure. He claimed that the temple would be destroyed and that not one stone would be standing on another and that it would be restored in 3 days. Many of the Judeans and also many of the Galilean element he led to himself in a tumult. He was believed to be a king, for he opposed paying the tax to Caesar. Many were roused, thinking that thereby the tribe could free themselves from Roman hands. And on the accusation of first men among us, Pilate condemned him to be crucified. Many of his followers, the Galileans and Judeans, were slain and thus repressed for the moment. The movement broke out with great abundance when it was believed he appeared to them alive. Those that followed him at first did not cease to worship him, their leader in sedition, and this tribe has until now not disappeared. Does that sound like anything anyone knows about Jesus? Anywhere? No, not a single bit of this. There's not a single Christian on earth that would identify this as Jesus anywhere. So, how do you explain this? I pointed this out to Dave. Dave's explanation was, well, he was crucified by Pilate. You don't need anything more than that. They would know it was Jesus. Really? Because the Gospels alone say that Jesus was crucified with two other people who were both identified as rebels, by the way, and would fit the bill on this better than Jesus would. There were probably a lot of people crucified by Pilate. So how does this explicitly identify Jesus? It doesn't. Dave is just making things up. Dave does not know what he is talking about. He does not have a basic grasp on his sources. And for those wondering, that the quotation of that testimonium is from Dave's paper in the Journal of Greco-Roman Christianity and Judaism. The title is A Model Reconstruction of What Josephus Would Have Realistically Written About Jesus. So basically, in conclusion, not only could no one identify this as Jesus, there's no reasonable person that could have identified this as Jesus, and there's no reason to think that they could. It also, just methodologically, there's no way to actually get this as a reconstruction whatsoever. Dave's excuse is that it's not a reconstruction, but is a hypothetical model of what Josephus might have said, which is just a reconstruction. That is exactly what a reconstruction is. He's just playing semantics so that he doesn't have to have the same burden of proof. So yeah, Dave just made everything up. He lied, he plagiarized, he misrepresented sources, and fundamentally, nothing he says should ever be taken seriously.
Not even with a grain of salt. Hi, Fish and a Tie. Thank you for your super chat. I found an ossuary inscribed Aphia, daughter of Athenegros. Could this be Aphia of Paul's letter Philemon 1:2?
I doubt it. Fundamentally, I just don't. Firstly, I don't think that Appia existed. I think that she's probably a literary character along with everything in the Book of Philemon. That is a central part of my book, The Empty Prison Cell. But also, that name was very common. Like extremely common. So the idea that this is specifically our Appia is probably wrong. There's no way to actually, even if Philemon is authentic, the letter to Philemon is authentic, there's no way to actually get to that.
So in conclusion, he's trying to use some kind of methodology to deduce negative elements, or what he believes is negative elements that a Christian is, in his view, incapable of offering, by cherry picking these different pieces of negative elements from so many different testimoniums to reconstruct a hypothetical original.
Yes. Yeah. It's just constant cherry picking, misrepresenting, and then when he's not cherry picking, he's also having to actively misrepresent sources so that he can pretend that various data points don't actually exist because they would contradict his thesis.
And I'm just trying to wrap my head around how does he think that Josephus mentioned Jesus when his own model reconstruction doesn't mention Jesus? How does he know that's Jesus?
Exactly.
Even if
it's
he's wrong.
Circular reasoning from the start. Dave knows it's Jesus because Dave has already decided it was Jesus and that Josephus wrote about Jesus. So basically, Dave has writer's clairvoyance. So he knows it's obvious because he's already decided what it was from the beginning. And so he's just come up with this to fulfill his basically dream version of Jesus. It is essentially just really bad historical Jesus apologetics translated into textual criticism. I put that in quotation marks because it's just bad. He is fundamentally just starting from the conclusion Josephus wrote about Jesus, so this passage is going to be about Jesus, regardless of the fact that it obviously is not, in the way that he has constructed it.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me today, Chrissy Hansen.
Thank you for having me.
And before I close, I just want to remind everybody to check his check her article out. The link is in the description below, and it's also pinned in the live chat, and it's also going to be in the pinned comment in the comment section below.
Let me get this for you to share as well. I have a publicacademia.edu page as well for that you can download a ton of my academic peer-reviewed papers at completely for free. So I want to make sure that everyone can see that. So I'm going to share this in the private chat. And there you go.
Okay. So I'll just go ahead and add this link to the description. Just real quick. And I'm going to put that in the chat as well. There we go. Actually, I can do better than that. I'm going to copy both links so that way they can be pinned together in the live chat. There we go. Better together. So both links will be posted together also in the comment section, pinned together. So y'all can go check it out. All right. Thanks again, Chrissy.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.